pass directly to your presentation. So Dr. Catherine Sullivan is an associate professor of political science at Ohio University. She is the author of Constitutional Context, Women and Rights Discourse in 19th Century America from the Johns Hopkins University Press, 2007. With Patricia Strach, she has written a book on 19th century municipal garbage program and corruption, a forthcoming article, Sailors, Crimps, and Commerce, Laws Protecting Seamen, 1866-1884, continues her study of the development of state and local authorities that shape the racial and gender dimensions of citizenship. She received her PhD from the Department of Government at the University of Texas at Austin in 2002. Thank you very much, Kathleen. Dr. Patricia Strach, she is a professor in the Departments of Political Science and Public Administration and Policy, and a Howard J. Samuels State and City Policy Center Fellow, 2021-2022. With Kathleen S. Sullivan, she has written the book on 19th century municipal garbage programs and corruption. Dr. Strach is an expert in public policy and mass politics and is the author of Hiding Politics in Plain Sight, Cost Marketing, Corporate Influence, and Breast Cancer Policymaking from Oxford University Press, 2016. And also she's the author of All in the Family, The Private Roots of American Public Policy, Stanford, 2007. As well as numerous articles, she was a Robert Wood Johnson Scholar in Health Policy Research at Harvard after receiving her doctorate in political science from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2004. Thank you very much, Patricia, for having with us. Without further delay, I will give the word to Dr. Strach and Dr. Sullivan. Thank you for being here with us. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to put up my presentation, which you should be able to see here. And I want to thank you for inviting us here today to talk about our research on municipal corruption in 19th century garbage collection and disposal. And the first question you might ask, or the first question we always get asked, is how and why do we look at garbage collection in particular, such a dirty topic or policy? And we started we didn't start out with a love of sanitation. We started out with a question. And that was, in the late 19th century, cities across the United States faced a similar problem, which was mounting trash. And you can see that photo, that's a picture of New York. There's a trash piled up on the side of the streets. And it caused a really big problem in cities across the country. It smelled really bad. It was hard to pass through the streets. You can see that buggy. It was literally difficult for them to get through because there was so much garbage. And most importantly, it was a danger to public health. So the question is, what did cities do? They're all facing a similar problem at roughly the same point in time. And what do they do about it? Now, the answer is that cities had to figure out both how to collect trash, how are they going to get it from houses and businesses, and then once they get it, what are they going to do with it? How are they going to get rid of this garbage? And they didn't have a single answer. So some cities had no municipal provision of trash collection. San Francisco, for example, did not have trash collection and still does not have city-based trash services. It doesn't mean that San Francisco is a dirty place with garbage all over. Instead, what happened was independent collectors worked with people who lived in their homes to collect their trash. And just the city didn't have a role in that particular process. These collectors dumped the garbage on land, they dumped it in the ocean, and later they burned it. So that's one way that cities dealt with trash collection. Some cities chose to have city-provided trash collection, where they hired workers to collect trash. So New Orleans had workers collect trash, and then they dumped it in the Mississippi River. And some cities chose to contract trash collection. And so what they would do is they would hire a company to pick up the trash and then to get rid of the trash. And that's what happened in St. Louis. And that's what these photos are So they contracted out to a collector, and there you see him right there. He's Ed Butler. He's notoriously corrupt. He is was bribing city officials, but he was the city trash collector as well. He kept that service for himself. He brought the trash to a facility which burned it and then kept some of the reusable products like grease and sold it. It was a pretty advanced way to deal with trash at the time. All of this sounds great, but if you can see that picture on the far right, it didn't actually work out in practice the way it was supposed to. Butler didn't actually pick up the trash. He didn't come around. So citizens put signs in their garbage basically saying, "Where, oh, where is Butler?" The city, to deal with this problem, to get rid of this very corrupt guy, ended up dumping their garbage on an island in the middle of the Mississippi River. And then trash started to pile up. So they imported a bunch of pigs to eat that garbage. And that's what you can see in that bottom picture. So the city goes from having this really kind of complicated, more advanced technology to dumping garbage and having it eaten by hogs. Now, this may be more than you want to know about garbage, but the point of these different examples to show you there wasn't one single way to address trash, not in the way that cities collected it and not in the way they disposed of it. So these various solutions didn't always make sense. And to us, we didn't know why cities were choosing to get rid of their trash in any kind of a particular way. So this is the same information, but put in the kind of way that maybe makes more sense than these stories that I'm telling you. So we started our project by collecting data on trash collection practices. And we pulled out this 900-page volume from 1900 about sanitation practices in the United States. We looked at what the cities did, and we kind of categorized them: how many collected by contract, how many collected by city employee, and how many had no municipal collection. And so this is kind of a more systematic way to get at what I showed you in the last slide, which is there is no one particular way that cities chose to deal with this particular problem. So our question was why? Why did cities address the same problem in different ways? Why didn't they all come up with the same method? Why didn't they decide what was most cost effective, or what was most sanitary, or what would help the most people? The answer why they chose these different solutions, why they chose to collect trash and dispose of trash in very different and kind of illogical ways, it seems to us at this point in time. This answer, which is probably not surprising to any of you in the room, is that it is the logic of corruption. So we like to think that a public policy is out there because it's the best way to solve a particular problem. And we like to think that the problem the policy is solving is something related to what that problem is: trash, sanitation, cleaning up the streets. But it's actually the logic of corruption is solving a very different kind of problem, which is motivating these local government actors to take up the problem of trash and motivating them to come up with some kind of solution, right? Just because it smelled bad, just because it made people sick, just because it made the streets really difficult to pass through, didn't mean that political actors were going to do anything about it. So it's corruption that motivated them to take up and create trash collection and disposal programs, and it motivated them to choose particular kinds of programs that would benefit them, right? So when you're trying to say, like, why would these cities do these very weird things? They did it because it benefited the actors in place at the time. So that is the logic. That kind of explains why these cities were taking these very different kinds of strategies in trash collection. So the reason that trash collection looks different in different cities, one of the things that Kathleen and I figured out as we're going through this, that we had a really difficult time explaining to our colleagues, was that corruption looks different in different kinds of cities. Corruption is organized differently in cities. And so there's this view from the outside, from people who don't study corruption, that if it's corrupt, it looks a particular way, and if it's not corrupt, it looks a different way. And instead of saying there's lots of variation in the kinds of corruption, how that corruption is organized, and how it works with these formal democratic institutions, these formal structures of government in these municipal cities. So this is a table from our paper that summarizes the form of corruption in each city, the various mechanisms that they use, and how it benefits kind of these corrupt city officials, how it makes them, how it motivates them, and how they benefit by creating these programs. So I'm just going to run through a couple so you get a sense of what this is like. So in Pittsburgh, I'll put a map up so you can see where we were, but in Pittsburgh, there was a political machine in place. And a machine was it was a partnership between the city treasurer and a party official / businessman. And they worked together to create this kind of political organization that is a machine. And the way the machine worked, the way that it operated, was that it rigged contracts in favor of itself, right? So the machine, the businessman actually owns a paving company. And so they say, look, there's trash in the streets, and we have the potential to make a lot of money because we already have, the wagons and carts to pick this trash up. We can build a plant to dispose of this trash, and then we can make even more money. So what they did is they rigged city contracts. They put out a bid. They said, hey, let's bring in contracts. We'll see who can get those contracts. And they put language in those contracts for which they were the only people who would be eligible. So they were insured to get the contract, which they did. And so money was flowing from city kind of treasury into these machine-controlled businesses. And so as a result of creating these trash collection programs, they got richer and they consolidated their political power. They became more powerful, right? So this is why Pittsburgh chose to take up trash collection, and why it chose to contract out trash collection, and why it chose to dispose of it in a pretty high-tech plant for the time. St. Louis, by contrast, was an oligarchy. So this was some elite businessmen. They were not in government. They did not have an inside connection. So to get what they wanted, they bribed city officials, right? So they used money to bribe city officials to get contracts, right? So there were very lucrative lighting contracts. There were very lucrative trash disposal contracts. So they would bribe these city officials. They would get these contracts and they would make a lot of money. They provided services. They weren't the best services, but they actually provided services to the city. So it was money that was going from city coffers to these corrupt businessmen, and these corrupt businessmen were handing it off to politicians. It made the businessmen rich. It made the politicians a little wealthier. And so that's why they did it. It wasn't for some public good. It wasn't to make the city a better place. It was for them to be richer. Charleston had an aristocracy of sorts. So there was a series of ruling families in Charleston. They were very wealthy. These were slave-holding, plantation-owning families. And they would give services to other families, other of these elite families. They would pay them. And so in this case, they would hire out the slaves of the city's elite. So they would pay a plantation owner, slave owner, to rent out their slaves to pick up the trash. After slavery was abolished, they used convict labor to do the same thing. So again, they're using city money to kind of reinforce the financial wealth and elite position of these few kind of ruling families. New Orleans had a ring. They had a kind of a patronage system. This was a very, very weak political system. So they wanted to be like Pittsburgh. They wanted to have a machine. They wanted to have a lot of control, and they didn't have it. So they would give out jobs. They chose to hire, they had a city collection. And they chose to hire people that were recommended by lower level politicians, by city politicians. And they did that to build their political support. They were very weak. They needed to build political support, and they did it by giving out jobs, right? So again, the money is coming from the city. It's being distributed to this working class constituencies to bolster their electoral support. Columbus, which is in gray, is in contrast because it's kind of a progressive city. And unlike these other four that we talked about, they're actually following expert advice. They're listening to the engineers, they're listening to the technical staff, and they're providing good garbage services, right, to keep themselves in power. So they're a different kind of, so they're not corrupt, but at the same time, they're using kind of shady practices to keep themselves in power, disenfranchising particular populations, et cetera. So they're different, but they're not that different from those other four corrupt actors. Now, we're able to make the connection between municipal corruption and sanitation programs for two reasons. One is definitional and one is methodological. So I'm going to talk about the definition on this slide and the methods on the next. And our definition of corruption is very broad. We don't only look at corruption as illegal activity, because when you're really powerful, like they were in Pittsburgh, you're able to make your actions legal. You're able to control government enough so that you can make it what you're doing legal. But we do define corruption as the abuse of power for personal or party profit, which allows us to see the work that corruption is doing. Right? There is a purpose for corruption. There is a reason that it's there. And to kind of understand the reason that it's there, to understand the work that it's doing, we use this much broader definition of corruption. And the other thing that we do is methodological. We're able to make the connection because we have good data. This is really an advantage to this particular project, which you probably don't have if you're studying contemporary corruption, because there's good data in the archives in our cities. And so you can see the cities that we visited here. And 19th century officials were not shy about their corrupt activities. They didn't hide them. They didn't try to say, oh, we're doing something that's good. And as Kathleen's going to show you, the evidence that we have, they're showing these quid pro quo. Look, I did something for you. Now you do something for me. In one of the cities we looked at in Pittsburgh, they said corruption wasn't an open secret because it wasn't a secret. So that's really an advantage that we have. We are looking at the 19th century. These records lay bare the relationship between corruption and government, so we can really clearly track that out. And we don't have to worry about anybody getting mad at us or not liking our research findings, because all of these people are long gone. So how can we take these insights that we have learned from our project and apply them to corruption research today? How can you recognize corruption and the work that it is doing in the places that you are studying? I'm going to turn it over to Kathleen to talk more about how we pieced it together. Kathleen, I'll advance the slides, just let me know.
Okay, I'll let you know. Thanks, Patty. So our research finds that certain kinds of corruption can yield resources for governance. And since many of you here today are carrying out your own research projects in which you're looking for corruption or identifying it in places where people might deny it, perhaps, we'd like to talk not so much about our findings as about our process. We'd like to walk you through our process of discovering corruption in our visits to the archives. And we do have the advantage of it being historical, of just having these documents of people no longer alive who were really quite candid about what they were up to. So first of all, we did not go into this project expecting to study corruption. We knew there was corruption in this time period, right? Because of scholarly literature about it and about political machines and such. But we actually didn't know how that connected to garbage collection, because this period of the 1890s and the early 20th century is also the progressive era. And it could have been that garbage collection was a sign of political development and a sign of municipal reform. So we kind of walked in with presumptions that if a city had a municipal garbage collection, it must be moving away from the spoil system, away from the old way of doing politics, and must be a reformist government. And, you know, we also, you could see in like statements of city officials at the time, or, you know, partisan newspapers, that city officials would brag about their garbage collection. So just reading some of those writings at the time would let us to assume that garbage collection was a modernizing reform project. Another thing is that when we began to look at archives, we were already primed to look for the role of private actors because we were coming in with a framework of governance. So our question was, if governments wanted to pick up the garbage, what resources were available? And it is possible, as Patty's already shown, that, you know, some business might have the horse and carts and might be ready to engage in that collection, having resources that cities lacked. So just if a city contracted out garbage collection, we didn't assume that that was corruption, right? We just assumed the city was making use of available resources. So yeah, but as we visited archives for each of our cities and did background research before and after visiting, we were faced with moments that really puzzled us or just seemed kind of odd. And oftentimes it was at this point of disconnect that we would just note that something odd was going on. We couldn't piece it together at the time. We didn't try to, but we held on to those moments where we were puzzled, and that ended up serving us really quite well. So I want to walk you through some of the moments we encountered in the archives. So Patty, I'm ready for the next slide. Yeah, so we're in Pittsburgh, right? Yeah. So in Pittsburgh, we knew there was a political machine. It was run by these two men here, Christopher McGee and William Flynn. And Flynn is the person that we focus on. He was a co-owner of a street paving company. He was the boss of the Republican Party in Pittsburgh. And in the very first municipal ordinance for garbage collection in Pittsburgh in 1894, the city contracted out garbage collection and disposal. And that contract went to William Flynn's brother, Charlie. So yeah, he was enmeshed in garbage collection and corruption. So luckily, William Flynn left his letter book to the archives at University of Pittsburgh. So the letter book is a bound collection of copies of outgoing correspondence that Flynn had written. So we had access to Flynn's voice. So I'm ready for the next slide. Thank you. So we were able to piece together kind of what Flynn's corruption looked like. This is a page from the annual report of the Department of Public Works. So this is formal City of Pittsburgh document. And this is kind of how Flynn started. His street paving company was called Booth and Flynn. And as you can see, it received an inordinate number of the street paving contracts. And so what he did was he would work with the Department of Public Works, and they would perhaps say, all right, the city is going to use asphalt, but that asphalt must be sourced from a pitch lake in the island of Trinidad. And Booth and Flynn controlled that lake in the Isle of Trinidad. So that's when Patty mentioned that before, that the contracts were rigged to only allow asphalt that Booth and Flynn had access to. So they were already enmeshed in pretty much controlling street paving in Pittsburgh. His letter books showed us other things that he was up to. Next slide, Patty. Yeah, I hope you can read this from your seats, but this is a letter that was just one of many, but it basically is Flynn writing letters to someone, recommending someone he knows for a government position. And so that's kind of like basic work of a spoil system, right? There's a few letters in the letter book in which he cast doubt on someone who was going to be appointed, and he would ask, is that really the man for the job? He wasn't questioning their qualifications for the job, he was questioning their loyalty. So he was very involved in these patronage appointments that were happening all the time. And his letter book also shows just work a party boss would be doing. So Pittsburgh is in Western Pennsylvania. He would be working with party officials in Philadelphia and kind of working at the state level to work on the Republican Party and its control. So those are all kind of pretty standard operations of the spoil system. Can we go to the next slide? But what we also saw in his letter books were all these petty favors that he was involved in. So here's one about railway tickets. So there are multiple letters in these letter books in which Flynn writes to a railway company asking for railway passes for certain people. It is very clearly part of a system of favors, of quid pro quo, but it also just seems so small, right, to get someone railway passes. And it's small, but Flynn takes such a close interest in it. He writes the letters, he singles out the people, he is the one doing this work. He didn't farm out the work to an assistant or anyone else. So what, bribery can be, involve great sums, or it can involve mundane matters like this, right? But in addition to that, I guess it was just surprising how engaged Flynn was. There was even a note in these letters about shoelaces. So he wrote to a company in New York and he asked for half a dozen shoelaces because he had just bought shoes from this business and the laces were rotten. And so he didn't just want the laces replaced, he wanted a half dozen laces. And I think he's really talking about laces. Like, I don't think this is some deal he's making and it's code for something else. I think he actually wants a half dozen shoelaces from a business in New York because he's mad at them that they sold him shoes with shoddy laces. And it's the shoelaces letter that really, I think, revealed how Flynn operated, right? It's like he's so petty and he's so on it. He will follow through on those things. He'll wheel and deal and he'll do that work himself. So while Flynn's letter books tell us the story of a party boss engaged in favor exchanges of political machines, it was really these petty favors that told us so much about how Flynn operated. It gave us a sense of the energy that he brought to even mundane matters. And I'm kind of sharing this, like, even what I'm talking about hasn't made it into any of our written writing. So I guess I'm just sharing, like, we're sitting in the archives looking at this stuff. And, when you just have a moment, like, why is this guy talking about shoelaces? We just kind of carried that, right? It kind of told us something, even if we didn't know what that told us. So we're ready for the next slide, Patty. So what we can see is that energy to give out railway tickets to cronies and to get new shoelaces, he brought that energy to the garbage collection contract. So the neat thing about Pittsburgh is that Pittsburgh ended up contracting out to have a reduction plant. So a reduction plant was a garbage disposal plant, a little bit like an incinerator in which it would burn garbage, but it wouldn't burn it down to ash. Instead, it would burn garbage using a process that had been shown on the previous slide that would extract grease from that product. And that grease was potentially saleable. So the idea was that if cities or these businesses could use this new technology, get it up and running, they could actually make money off of garbage. It was really innovative. It was really exciting. It's one reason why businesses were willing to get the contract to see if they could get rich by burning garbage. And what we find is that kind of potential opportunity in garbage disposal was something that Flynn was really excited about. So in his letters, you see him, he kept an eye on how much grease came out, and he was, again, very closely involved. And I guess they had sold their first batch of grease to Procter & Gamble back then, and real excited to see, like, if they could keep going. But he does other things too. Like, Flynn was in negotiations with, or in talks with Rochester, New York and Washington, D.C., because he wanted to help them set up reduction plants in their cities. And, he could make a lot of money off it. But what's interesting about that is that that's what municipal reformers and sanitarians were also doing at the time. They were trying to get cities to invest in new innovations, to do clean garbage collection and disposal. And so, in a sense, Flynn is no reformer, but just following his own kind of initiatives, right? Just kind of the way he operates, he ended up doing the same similar work that reformers of the time were doing, which was to develop the technology of garbage collection. So perhaps we could have gleaned all this from a top-down story, but the mundane aspects of these letter books really helped us to make sense of some of the practices of this particular party boss. We got a sense of the energy that Flynn brought to reduction. And also, you know, that garbage contract went to Flynn's brother, and you might just cast it off as nepotism. It was nepotism, but we were able to get a sense of Flynn's style, that you know, his brother was obviously a cover, like Flynn was the one who had the real interest in owning this reduction plant. But we also saw the ways in which he was involved in technological development. And it was this observation in which we started to see that, you know, corruption can be a resource of a government when it's trying to get stuff done. So Flynn was kind of our first lesson in how corruption works to be involved in political development. Okay, I think I'm ready for the next slide. Yeah, so now we go to New Orleans. So New Orleans was a city, it was one of the first cities that we studied. It was listed as having public garbage collection, and as we saw, it had a brief fling with contracting out for a reduction plant, as Pittsburgh did. That failed. And so by the time Charles Chapin collected statistics in 1900, it had public garbage collection. But we just had assumed if a city had public garbage collection, that must have indicated it had capacity and, you know, it had developed. And when we got to New Orleans and looked through even the public records, but also reports from civic associations and other interested parties, we found that New Orleans garbage collection was just spectacularly awful. Much of the infrastructure in the city was really underdeveloped, and many of the streets were unpaved, which made it hard for carts to pass through, which ended up you know, becoming a hazard for public health, and it impeded commerce. So it impeded sanitation, but it also impeded commerce. So we saw that in New Orleans after the yellow fever epidemic of 1878, some businessmen and other city leaders got together to form the Auxiliary Sanitary Association, and they offered to help. They said, "We'll clean the gutters. We'll furnish new garbage carts. We'll arrange for garbage collection." Like, businessmen were very interested in sanitation to literally clear the streets so that literally commerce could pass through. So businessmen had a real interest in, you know, fundamental sanitation. And what we found is that the city rebuffed offers from this association to set up garbage collection. And so this was a clue for us that there was a sincere, competent offer in 1878 and 1879 to clean the streets and collect garbage that would help public health, that would help commerce, right? It would help just quality of life in the city, and the city turned it down. So it made us see that, oh, maybe public services weren't just about accomplishing a task, right? Maybe there was a moment it would take for government to decide that they wanted to initiate public services. And as we would come to find out, a lot of cities decided they would take up public services when they could get a cut out of it in one way or another. Okay, I'm ready for the next slide. So what happened in New Orleans was that in 1894, 1895, they set up a garbage contract very similar to Pittsburgh's, and at just about the same time. And they contracted it out to a business who was going to collect the garbage and then take it to this reduction plant. And what we found is that just failed. It failed utterly. The people would not comply with it. They would not sort their garbage the way they wanted to. The public got really fixated on really odd things to resist this garbage collection program. So they complained about shoes, that the garbage collector wouldn't let them put shoes in the garbage, and that really rankled them. And also they required, the contractor required a certain kind of garbage box to be used. And so people got fixated on the garbage box, were writing poetry about it and such. It was just, like, it was a feud over garbage that was just about really ridiculous stuff. But in the background was serious partisan conflict going on. But what we couldn't figure out was why New Orleans was resisting this garbage contract. So we kept digging into the company that landed that garbage contract. And that's on the next slide. And so in digging a little deeper, we found that rather than, you know, the contract going to the brother of the party boss, as in Pittsburgh, the garbage contract went to a company owned by this fellow, Maurice HART. He was an out-of-towner. He was already caught up in a number of, you know, illegal schemes and irregular schemes. And so he was just there to make money and did not seem like a reliable person. And so it was easy for people from the other party to just target that. And so the public and other, you know, the other parties went after the contract and refused to comply with the contractor. And it just went south. Even the mayor kind of lost his regime over this garbage scandal. So as corrupt as Pittsburgh's William Flynn was, he still made the city run and he still followed through somewhat. We don't want to overstate how well Pittsburgh picked up garbage, but it did it adequately. So in contrasting like this disaster in New Orleans with, you know, success in Pittsburgh, we started to think about different types of corruption. And it seemed to us that what Pittsburgh had was integrated corruption, right? That machine controlled so many things that actually that helped strengthen the machine when corruption was called out. And really, Flynn's operation was unassailable. Even after his machine went down, they continued to use his garbage collection company. And so we saw that close connections led to actual delivery of public services, while looser connections, whether it's an out-of-towner or a city like New Orleans that had, you know, frequent rotation in political regimes, those regimes were more easily challenged and resistance could bring the whole effort down. So that's when we started to see that some types of corruption are more suitable or more successful at delivering public services than others. Okay, ready for the next slide. And there was another thing that we saw in New Orleans, which is that a lot of times you would see in city reports that officials would say, oh, everything's going great. We're picking up the garbage, everything's fine. And so luckily we had access to this one person, George Smith, who was a commissioner of public works for years. And he would write these reports to the city council. I think it was just about every month. And you just got a sense that his letters would say, you know, things are going okay, but, you know, it looks like these boats need caulking. And so we might want to keep an eye on the boats. And then months would go by and he's like, yeah, you know, we really should tend to the boats. And then he'd have a letter where like the boats are sinking, or the wharfs too. One wharf also just got destroyed, just eroded. And so there was a sense that you can look at the formal statements that everything's going great, and then you can look at some of these voices who are giving us signs that things are not going well. And so Smith's letters are on record, but they weren't really, you know, the story that the city was telling. And this reminded me a bit of Elizabeth and Oliver's recent article in Governance, right? When you explained that there was a way of kind of laundering corruption by sending it through city agencies. So when it came out, it looked like it was all legitimate and fine. This, I think, is an episode of that there's a kind of underbelly in which things aren't going well, but on its face, the city can claim that things are just fine. So finding those disconnects was a really important moment for us, because if we just looked at official records, we would have thought that everybody just had great garbage collection. Let's see, I'm going to move on to San Francisco. We could go next slide. Great. So San Francisco. So San Francisco is the city that is labeled as having no municipal collection, but it's certainly collected garbage. So these collectors, who were known as scavengers, would contract house by house and they would pick up household garbage. And we were really, really quite taken by how well San Francisco scavengers did in collecting garbage. So when we got to the archives, we started to get a glimpse that they were indeed very adept at garbage collection, but they were also adept at maintaining their hold on garbage collection. So the San Francisco scavengers operated on their own, and there were different groups that would do this. But what we would find is that every once in a while, the city would try to take over garbage collection. And when it did, the scavengers would close ranks, and they found all sorts of ways to resist. Like if the city wanted to raise the rates at the dump pass that charge on to the scavengers, they would just go dump it somewhere else. And it was an act of resistance that the city couldn't, the city would eventually just capitulate to the scavengers' demands. In the 1920s, there were these garbage wars where the city tried to take over garbage collection, and different groups of scavengers consolidated themselves. So they made these organizations, like mutual organizations. So they made them the Sanitation Guild or the Sunset Scavenger Company. And so that allowed them to kind of, gather their resources to fight the city. But another thing that they did is that they reached out to housewives in particular. They reached out to women. So the thing about garbage collection, right, is that people leave their cans at their curb. And so once a week, you have these men who come and, kind of enter people's property and collect their garbage. And in San Francisco, the scavengers had established these friendly relations with the householders. So they knew one another. So when the city was trying to take the business or take control of garbage from the scavengers, they used their relationships with housewives as a resource to resist that takeover. And they were just incredibly successful with it. So, so next slide. So I have a few bits of trivia about San Francisco. One is that those scavengers are still in operation. The Sunset Scavenger Company, which was formed as a combination of scavengers during the garbage wars, continues to this day under the umbrella of a company called Recology. And San Francisco's garbage collection is excellent. They collect compost, they're working towards zero waste. It's an incredibly progressive city in garbage collection to this day. Another bit of trivia is that, breaking news, Recology was recently charged by the US Department of Justice for bribery. So a few executives in Recology had bribed the director of public works. And what is so evocative of the historical work we found is that some of the bribery was, hundreds of thousands of dollars that was invested in the director of public works nonprofit company. And that's a big bribe. But there were also all of these mundane sort of things they did, like Recology gave a job to the son of the director of public works. Some public works employees visited New York City to tour a pneumatic waste collection system. And those executives paid for 2 nights in a luxury hotel. Like Flynn of Pittsburgh, corruption can be so petty, right? It can be so small, but those favors really matter. A final fact to share about Recology is that about 10 years ago, a few people in San Francisco wanted to challenge Recology's monopoly on garbage collection. And they proposed a ballot measure to alter garbage collection and allow for new haulers to enter the landscape. And the people of San Francisco voted it down. 76.57% of San Franciscans voted down the proposal to change garbage collection. They like their garbage collectors. They did in 1929, and they still do. So even after this bribery scandal that just occurred, news stories say that the people of San Francisco separated the executives of Recology from the collectors who arrive at their curbside week after week. They like them, they don't blame them, and they want to keep them. So, while our historical cases and archival work is far removed from the interviews that many of you are doing to study corruption today, what we do find in the archives are actors being really forthcoming, and we're able to find records that don't match up with one another. We're able to find the relationships between public and private actors that don't just allow people to achieve personal gain, but to also hang on to power and also to get the things done that we need done in government. Patty, I will pass it to you now.
All right, and we're just going to conclude, so we have some time for questions, that our focus was not going into this was corruption, but with governance. How do governments function? What is the relationship between different actors? What resources do they use to accomplish their goals? And when we think in terms of governance, corruption is part of the process. It's not something that's come in and infected it, or it's not something that can just easily be taken out. It's playing a particular role. So the key question to ask for us, and that we would encourage you to think about, is what work is corruption doing in the particular location that you're studying? What problems does it solve? So in Pittsburgh, it solved a lot of resource problems. There were, a lot of knowledge, a lot of physical infrastructure. And so there's a phrase in the area that Kathleen and I work in, and it says, all the world is Tokyo, right? And so instead of thinking about a blank slate in which you can take corruption out or put it in, to think about it as in downtown Tokyo, which is, absolutely packed. And if you want to put something in, something has to come out. So understanding what that structure is and what role it's playing is central to kind of understanding the work that corruption does. What keeps corruption? What are the mechanisms that keep corruption in place? Because, and I'm citing Perez Chicas, you cannot design a solution without understanding the problem the problem adequately. And I think that's why corruption is so intractable. We'd love to take questions if you have any.
Well, thank you very much, Patricia and Kathleen. It has been a very, very interesting presentation. We've been having a lot of discussions about precisely this relation of corruption and governance, which is basically, I think, something that at least there is this kind of a stream of literature that sees corruption within governance, but only like in developing countries.
Yes.
And now that you bring this out to the light about the United States, for example, it makes us, I guess, rethink about how, the governance works, and not necessarily specifically attached to developing countries or third world countries, but that it might be something that it could be very interesting to look around in many other places. So, let me see if there are other questions that we have here. If not, I have some questions that I can put forward. And also, I would love to see if anybody in our social networks have any questions about the presentation. Colleagues, any comments, questions? No? Okay.
Y si movemos la esta para que nos puedan ver la camarita, o nos acercamos a la tercera pregunta. Sí. Como así en la mesa o algo así.
No lo vais a desconectar allá de alguna forma.
Es todo lo que... No, adelante, yo nada más digo, tengo algunas preguntas.
Please go ahead.
No. I was just saying, I'm Daniel Sisumbo from here from CIDE, from the Division of Multidisciplinary Research. So I just find fascinating how the last story that you were telling about the people not wanting to get rid of this corrupt company out of a feeling of proximity with the public servants who are closest to them. And that was fascinating to me because I find it very interesting how proximity, to me, it seems like a very counterintuitive story to the standard decentralization argument, right? How proximity to some public services could stand in the way of accountability and the capacity of well, either representatives or or elected politicians to hold accountable these sections of bureaucracy, right? So that's very interesting, and I just wanted to know if you had any thoughts on that phenomenon that you observe in San Francisco, and whether you've seen it replicated somewhere else, maybe in the United States or in other places. Thank you so much.
Yeah, that's a great question. I appreciate that. And I think one thing I'm thinking that came out of just this recent episode in San Francisco is that they did hold that company accountable, that they have to return. I think it's a lot of money. I forget the amount, but it's millions of dollars that is going to be reimbursed in people's garbage, their whatever their local garbage count is. So the citizens or the residents of San Francisco are actually going to be reimbursed for whatever costs this bribery incurred. And so they're getting paid back, but the company itself is not going to suffer. And yet the residents feel like, oh, well, we just lost money, we're getting that paid back, and we still have this great garbage program that we really like. And so it's interesting to see how the city kind of restored itself afterwards and who they wanted to blame. And they ended up just blaming individuals, not the company itself, just those few executives who engaged in that bribery. They're gone, of course. Yeah, so I think, one thing about governance and thinking of it as relations is that then we don't have these kind of like hegemonic notions of there's a company as if it's one sort of being. If you look at the relationships that people develop, they're able to keep some and address others. So that allows some complexity to these questions.
And I think just what's most remarkable about the San Francisco story is it's the exact same thing 100 years later. So again, there's this, controversy, and are we going to keep this company? And yes, we are, for the exact same reasons. You really hit on something that's very lasting in San Francisco. And I don't know about other places, but likely in other places, people like the direct service providers they have, and they're willing to keep them even if they know that everything's not perfect with that particular service provider. And even when they find out that, they've been scamming millions of dollars.
I could share an anecdote. This is not from our research, but I live in a small college town in Appalachian, Ohio. It's very rural, very, very remote. And a couple of years ago, the city was going to change its contract from our current contractor is doing lots of innovative recycling and composting. Everybody loves them. And this other kind of large regional company wanted to come in and underbid and get the contract. We had a city hall meeting in which it was absolutely packed. They had to put people into other rooms and watch the town hall meeting by satellite. And a city council member got up and said, "You people really like your hauler, don't you?" And we all stood up. We got up and spoke and defended our hauler because we like these guys. We know they do good work. We like their product. And so, yeah, I do think it's something we could look at more broadly about those relationships that have been fostered that maybe nobody really talks about, right? But they matter in moments of crisis.
Can I ask another question, or somebody else has a question? Or maybe you.
I have a doubt. This is not a question. Probably this part of another research. But I was thinking about the dynamics of the cities at that time, because I love jazz. So I read about New Orleans, and at that time New Orleans was like this big city driven by commerce. So probably at that moment New Orleans was more important city than San Francisco. So these dynamics of population, different communities working there. So to what extent this could affect or promote this kind of dynamics in corruption? That's my point.
If I make, we can get a couple of questions. So this is one.
My second question is very related to that, and it's also about dynamics. And I was wondering about the dynamics of corruption in the cities that you were. I'm very curious about whether you could talk a bit more about the dynamics of corruption in these cities, because you started the presentation setting up the question as why different cities take different approach to trash collection or garbage collection, right? So my first impulse was saying, well, this is natural, like this is policy experimentation, or is maybe the first time that they're being forced to provide this huge public service, and they're experimenting, or maybe citizens are still not used to even seeing this as a responsibility of authorities. At that point, like if you go to in Africa or in Mexico to some places like very rural places, sometimes people see disposing garbage as their own responsibility, and they just burn it in their backyards. They don't even see it as a responsibility of government. So my first impulse was to say, okay, this is just natural, and this is an evolutionary process in which cities just randomly try to solve this problem, and then institutions and democracy kind of work themselves into the system, and eventually will with time, order and policy order starts emerging until we see whatever we see today. So I was wondering whether you could talk a little bit more whether what I'm talking about is true. Is this the first time that these cities are having to provide this service? Or maybe they came from a previous order, and then it came this order, and then the order came again, or order never came. And as you were saying, all of these cities are still experiencing like path dependency, and everyone is still experiencing corruption, right? So I just wanted to know about a little bit more about these dynamics and what you think is the underlying process.
I think these two questions, Kathleen, I'm going to jump in and I'm going to turn it over to you. I think that they are very related to one another. So these are great questions, because when we think about what are the dynamics of the cities, this is exactly what we're getting at with thinking about governance. You have cities that are developing at this time. It's after the Civil War. New Orleans is literally a mess. Like, it's a tropical city. It's very hot, and it's, disease prone. It's right on the water. Ships are coming in. So corruption is filling a void. So corruption comes in, and oftentimes corrupt people, corrupt actors are able to kind of fill a gap or fill a need that the city has, right? So they I don't mean to say that these are great people who are doing great things for the city, but in New Orleans, they can't get their act together. They can't, no reform or corrupt actors can kind of get a hold on the city, stay in power, implement policy reforms. They're just seesawing back and forth, right? So corruption can kind of come in and fill a void in terms of creating some kind of stability for business to invest in garbage, as it did in Pittsburgh, or in eventually New Orleans, they disenfranchise Black Americans in Louisiana, and then New Orleans machine actually is able to form, and they're able to hold on to power for decades. So a lot of times corruption is providing stability, it's providing resources, it's providing capacity to do things. So you're absolutely right, these cities are different, and that corruption is filling a particular need in each city. And because they have particular resources, and because they're like stuck in government in a particular way, they choose a particular kind of solution. So it is not random what they're doing and how they fit into governments. And it's also not random because experts are saying the exact same thing in lockstep. Here's what you should do. And what is most remarkable is how clearly they're ignored in city after city after city. They're like, hey, we'll help you out, like Kathleen is saying, or hey, we have these ideas on how to do it right. And they're just completely sidelined. Kathleen, you want to pop in there?
That is right where I'll pick up. And I'll pick up in the last point of your question, which is that, there are developing countries where people don't see it as a public responsibility. They see it as a personal responsibility. Now, Patty and I were very proud of ourselves for taking our whole project and doing one little bite of it. But now I'm going to bring in the book because our book actually talks about that very thing. So what we find is, and this is coming from the work of sanitarians at the time, is they described that garbage collection had not been seen as a public responsibility in American cities, through much of the 19th century. And it was only when cities reached a level of concentration where garbage was piling up, or people in cities were putting garbage in their privies, right? And then stuff was happening there, that it was becoming just untenable. And now what's interesting is that we were able to track sanitarians, so people who were maybe in a local board of health, for example. And in some cities, the sanitarians who were in the board of health had been trying for decades to do garbage collection. And they tried it on their own. They might have kind of contracted out one-on-one with scavengers, not with big companies, but just with, a few men to try to get garbage collection up and running. And so that's where we see that it was those sorts of professionals who did see garbage as a public responsibility. They were given some authority by cities, but they lacked the capacity to do it. And so as you get to the 1890s, you have all sorts of interests. You have public health officials, there's municipal reformers, there are civic reformers who want to make people's lives better in all sorts of ways. And then there are engineers who are coming up with all these newfangled contraptions to do this in an innovative way. And by that point, they had their own interests or their own concerns about making this a public responsibility. But it's that question of capacity that helped us to see why just having a good idea to clean up cities doesn't automatically turn into garbage collection. It was the regime seeing that they could benefit from it that made them pick up these suggestions by sanitarians and then just pick it up and run away with it and try to do it themselves, and to leave these reformers largely out of it. They really didn't want them meddling in their own programs.
I have another question, just very briefly. So first of all, it was very interesting to hear that corruption fills a void, right? So it gets basically very ingrained in the machinery. So I guess that following the note that Elizabeth said about knowing the problem to understand the solution, for example, my question to you would be, and I am sorry for this question, these are the awful questions that are made to academics about policy implications and stuff like that. But so what is that void made of that corruption is feeling? Like, is it something only about lack of capacity? Is it something about certain kinds of institutions that need to be in place and that are not in place, so then corruption gets it? So what is that void made of? And if that can give us some idea about how to more or less tackle, tame, mitigate this problem of corruption, just for it not to get, too expanded. This is just one question, awful questions about policymaking. The second question would be, if you find any relation, theoretically relation, with this other literature of Susan Stokes about regime theory in local governments. Like, because for example, I remember this theory talking about different types of regimes in municipalities, and you have a managerial regime, you have this other political regime, which is basically this long-standing group of actors that are in power for a long time, or more or less stable, and that they have this agenda, right, that they are following. And if there's any kind of match, or if there's any kind of talking between your findings and these other approximations to politics in local governments. Those are the two open questions.
Okay.
You want me to start or do you want to go, Kathleen?
You go first, Patty.
So I think the first question, like what need is corruption filling? I think that varies. I don't think corruption fills the same need in every particular place. And I think that's why corruption looks different and functions differently. Basically, what is the capacity that these corrupt actors have? What is the need a particular city has, and how do they get fit together or not fit together? How do they relate to one another? Those are the key questions in corruption research. Those are the key questions we have to think about it. Like, so in our cities, you can see there's very weak political capacity in New Orleans, and that's what corruption is trying to fill, trying to kind of strengthen political actors. They're fighting over it. And in Pittsburgh, they're already politically strong, and corruption is just there to help them kind of consolidate their power and allows them to provide services that they wouldn't otherwise be providing. So corruption is filling very different needs in these cities that we have based on kind of what's already there. What are the resources that are there? What are the capacity that is already there? And what is the void that corruption is filling? And I think once you can dissect that, if you can answer that in your own research, then you can think about what the reform potentials are, right? So what is the potential for reform? If it's a capacity problem, you have to replace that capacity. You cannot, as Elizabeth says, you cannot just say corruption's illegal, we need to go after it. If there's some void, then another corrupt actor is going to fill it if that first actor goes to prison. Right, so you have to think about how do we provide that capacity in another way? How do we provide that political power in another more palatable, less corrupt way? And then the relation to regime theory, I'm going to be totally honest. I reviewed a book and I was like, I don't understand why you're talking about regime theory. I should have paid more attention to that chapter because now I get a question on it. So we just don't know as much. We just haven't interacted with that literature. Maybe Kathleen knows more than I do.
No. Well, my take on that question is, obviously, yeah, we approach this looking for or recognizing lacks of capacity, and that's where we see the void. But that question of, are there institutions not in place? I want to be able to answer that. Like, and the other stuff I do is constitutional law, and constitutionalists love institutions, and like I wish I had a ready answer, and yet I don't. And that's what's so baffling about studying this. The cities at this time had departments of public works, they had boards of health, there were engineers working on public works, there were sanitarians in public health. It wasn't for lack of capable people in place. So institutionally, I can't think of an institution that there was a void for. The only thing I think that our study does in some way respond to this is when it gets to the point of compliance. So back to the other question that people initially didn't see garbage collection as a public responsibility. Well, one thing we found was that once garbage collection was up and running, people were not doing what they were supposed to do. They weren't putting their garbage out on the right day. They would just use anything, like any box or just anything to hold garbage. So it might not be covered, right? So dogs would knock it over, and then rats would come. It was this idea of this garbage can problem, and it was the problem of the cans and the people not using the cans the way the city needed to use them. Was a really big problem. And what they realized is that people weren't acclimated to just complying with standard garbage collection ordinances. And so to do that, we found, and again, I don't need to get into the whole book, but we do draw on the theory of infrastructural power to look at ways in which people were kind of disciplined to comply, but thinking they were doing it themselves because they take pride. They targeted housewives again. To have housewives, say, oh, I keep a nice house and I'm going to keep a nice curb. And anyway, and I'll model this for other people. This is the proper mode of citizenship. I don't know. I don't think that's answering the question that you asked. And yet it was where we were led to think about where another void was that they kind of encountered as garbage collection programs kind of started to fail a bit. So I guess that's, I don't know. I'm sort of not answering the question, and yet I think it's such an important question. So I'll throw it back.
Questions? I have another question, sorry. And this is a question that Elizabeth just reminded me, is that the theme of corruption very lately has been taking a very interesting edge, which is looking at corruption also with the lenses of gender and sex and race. So I don't know if you could, I mean, I know that the presentation was not basically geared to those topics, but I would love to know a little bit better on how to tackle, how to see that situation coming in terms of looking at corruption and its relation with these other themes.
I could start that one.
Yes, Kathleen, it's all you.
Yeah, so we also did not intend to study gender, sex, and race when we started this project, and now we have a chapter on gender and a chapter on racism in garbage collection. But through the same framework that we're using throughout. So what we found is that regimes would enlist people on the basis of sex and race when they needed them. So we find, for example, this garbage can problem I just described. Some cities would really foster women's civic organizations to really promote them and network with them and kind of pass off that job to them out in the social sphere to get people to be proper in putting out their garbage cans. And what we see is an intersectional construction of their civic identity, right? So it's middle-class white housewives who were kind of putting themselves as the model citizen based on their economic privilege, their racial privilege, and also kind of denigrating maybe poor neighborhoods, right, for not doing a proper job. And so you started to demarcate what neighborhoods were complying and what neighborhoods were just dirty, and just starting to have all connotations about those people who don't know how to do it right. And so this is another sense in which, even though it helped the garbage collection to improve, it's not always a project of modernization, right? It also is bringing in old status hierarchies and making them have new meaning under a moment of political development. And so that was, anyway, we trace that. Yeah. But again, it gets back to lack of capacity. It's to fill in that void and draw upon that as a resource.
Yeah, so if you think the way we think about a problem is what resources are used to address a particular problem, we see corruption as a resource, we see racism being used as a resource, and we see gender being used as a resource. And not that these are just things that are out there, these are things that governments and other kinds of actors are intentionally using to get a particular end that they want. And they can all be used, they can be used together, they can be used by corrupt actors, by non-corrupt actors, but these are resources that are used to solve a particular problem. So when you kind of use that framework of governance and resources, seeing the work that each of these things is doing is really helpful to understand how do you get people to put their garbage out? That's amazing to think about. Governments can change your behavior. It brought down the mayoral administration in New Orleans. And now in my neighborhood, you could set your watch at 7:30, all the men and the boys bring the garbage can out. And they don't think about it as political. That's just the way it is. So these kinds of things that are used, these resources that are used, they become embedded in these particular policy programs. And that's why you cannot just easily solve corruption, and you cannot easily solve racism, and you can't easily solve sexism, because they're built in, they're baked into the way we do public policy.
I was saying that this is super interesting, the view of corruption and also racism and sexism as a resource.
Yeah.
That governments have in order for them to, appeal some objectives, and that's very interesting, very revealing. Any other questions here? I think we don't have more questions, and I would like to basically, Patricia and Kathleen, thank you very much for this very interesting talk And we would love to very soon maybe chat again, and maybe if there's any chance, we would also like to discuss, these other methodologies that you have developed, because one of the things that students tell us very frequently is how difficult it is to study corruption, right? Because it's something that it has to be, under the rug. Nobody wants to see it. Or it's difficult for people to talk about it. And I think trying to understand how you approach this as a social scientist, and try to look at it, also maybe putting aside our prejudices and our normative biases, and to look at it as a different thing. These are some skills that we would love to transmit to our fellows, many of them are scattered around Mexico, looking at us through YouTube, and also with our group of researchers. So please, if you may, we will have to get in touch with you again, and maybe we could talk about these other things. Elizabeth?
It's my absolute pleasure, joy, everything to have you here with us as our, as well, my mentor, and as such influencers of our work also. So it's like, I'm really thankful for you to be here and to collaborate with us in Project Iceberg.
I want to thank you for the invitation. And I also want to say we've been doing these Zoom presentations, obviously everyone, for the past 2 years. This is the best experience to have a live audience. So I just wanted to compliment you on the way that you put this program together. That it's such a delight to present to a live audience, even though we're not there, compared to like a little bunch of boxes on a screen. So we really appreciate that.
And I'm so interested in where this project is going. I really want to look at the work that people are doing, the field work that you're doing, and keep up with it. It is so incredibly impressive. And we are both here for it. Yeah, please keep including us.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.